I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the organizing committee to the second session this morning. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speakers, Xiaolu and Tendai Huchu, whose perspectives on the topic of the conference, performing the urban embodiments, inventories, rhythms, will certainly be stimulated and thought-provoking in relation to their work. They will talk about the representation of urban spaces or about the reasons why the urban is not always essential in their work. Their inspiration fluctuates between the rhythms of different languages and cities, and I'm sure that they will probably talk about this once I'm finished. In Xiaolu's films and books, Beijing, Berlin, London coexist with the memory of former rural Chinese villages like Wenling, now transformed into a city with a population of over 1.4 million inhabitants. As she has expressed before, and I'm quoting, "Since she began to write in English in 2003, she's been living in multiple spaces, each with its own language. And she has had to find a personal voice, very interior and truthful in this interstice. Here, as she has explained, everyday writing seems to be a battle between the language I think in and the language I write in. And such transcultural, translinguistic, and translocal anxiety can be felt throughout her work." Xiao is a multifaceted artist, an essayist, a novelist, a screenwriter, filmmaker, whose work has been granted some of the most prestigious international awards. For instance, to mention just a few, her novel translated into English, Village of Stone, was shortlisted for the 2005 Independent Foreign Fiction Prize and the 2006 International Impactable Literary Award. Then, her first novel written in English, a concise Chinese-English dictionary for lovers, was shortlisted for the 2007 Orange Prize for Fiction and has been translated into more than 20 languages. In April 2013, she was named one of the best of young British novelists by Grant magazine. Her latest book is the memoir Once Upon a Time in the East, where among the complexities of growing up and getting ahead as a young girl in China, she describes the difficulties of transitioning from rural to globalized urban environments. Among her award-winning films are She, a Chinese, which we will have the opportunity to watch tomorrow at 2 in the lunchtime film screening and Q&A with the author. Her documentaries include The Concrete Revolution, which was awarded the Grand Prix in the 2005 International Human Rights Film Festival in France, and she was awarded the Guilder Film Prize for her film career at the 37th International Women Film Festival Florence in Italy, 2015. Tendai Huchu's fiction also navigates through spaces, Harare, Edinburgh, Leicester, and languages. As he has remarked, and I quote, "With English and Shona, I essentially have two very different software running simultaneously in my mind," end of quote. The former is the language of power. It brings with it a brutal baggage, a savage history of domination and exploitation. On the other hand, in Shona, the author finds the nuances and refinement that he needs, particularly when he thinks of social relationships or human interactions. Apart from short fiction, which has been published in the most consolidated international literary forums, his first novel, The Hairdresser of Harare, was published in 2010 to critical acclaim. It's been translated into several languages, including French, German, Italian, and Spanish, and this makes us very happy, the fact that both authors have been translated into Spanish. And in 2002, The Guardian included it, the Hairdresser of Harare, in the list of the 10 best contemporary African books. Set in Zimbabwe's capital city, the author's sharp social criticism is developed on the conflicts of the microcosms presented by the salon where his characters interact. In 2014, his short story, The Intervention, was shortlisted for the Cain Prize for African writing. His most recent novel is The Maestro, the Magistrate, and the Mathematician. This is set in Edinburgh, and it intertwines what could be regarded as three independent novellas concerning the lives of three Zimbabwean men in the Scottish capital city. Each one has specific tempo, yet Edinburgh becomes central in the narration of the events, especially in what concerns the character's experience of its micro-environments. As the author has expressed before, his novels are very local in their scope and concerns, yet somehow they manage to capture something universal about the human condition. Xiaolu and Tendai Huchu create sophisticated pieces with, while personal, effective portrayals of space incorporate individual rhythms to the collective choreographies of contemporary cities. These are spaces of resistance, of self-discovery that are very local and specific, yet at the same time they have a trans-spatial dimension. It is now time to listen to the authors, but before giving the floor to them, I would like to remind you that after the talks, you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions or comment on some of the points made.
What shall we do? We are being left alone. I thought I think we're both so different, so I will kind of describe you my life in the past and in the present, my journey come to the West. I guess you will do something better than me.
Oh, most definitely, without a doubt.
So, first, I found my spelling is wrong, but this side is correct. That's good. This side is like Xuzhong. Anyway, so who I am, I'm a Chinese by birth. I'm a British by law. I'm a European by spirit. And I think that's the identities I gathered in the last 15 years since I left China to Europe. I just want to kind of simply introduce my life and for you to somehow to have a very quick access of my work if you're interested. I guess, life as immigrant is sort of complicated, and also I'm using my second language now, speaking and writing after I left China. So this is sort of my kind of situation in the second city, in the second town, in the second country, or in the fifth country, in the sixth country. And I talked about all these things in my recent book, the memoir, Once Upon a Time in the East. But I think here I'm just going to use 5 minutes to introduce my life from my childhood until now. Although it's in this book, but I try to visualize for you. I grew up in this little fishing village you can see in South China, Southeast China, which is south of Shanghai. You can see Taiwan from my fishing village, and it's in Zhejiang province. And you can see the Chinese writings on top of the roof on this building, which is nearby my grandparents' house. And in Chinese character, it says, "Down with American imperialism." And it's still there. Recently, I visited my fishing village. It's still there after 50 years, kind of hatred to the enemy country. Still down with American imperialism, especially now, maybe it works, this slogan with Trump. And I grew up with very communist ideology, West is enemy. West in general is enemy. And China has been never colonized. And it's interesting, I became an Anglophone writer. So that's a fishing village I spent my life, the first 7 years, with my fisherman grandfather and my illiterate grandma. And this is the village I grew up. Now you look like island, because that's from my father's painting. So my father used to be a fisherman, and when he was 19, 20 years old, he decided to become a painter. And that's the reason he ended up in the labor camp for 25 years. Beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Before the Cultural Revolution, in the 60s, he went to the labor camp because he wanted to be a bourgeois painter. And in the end of the 70s, he returned to home. And all these years, he self-taught in the labor camp, become a painter. But he finally became a propaganda painter, which means state artist. So all his life painted, the great, amazing, glorious figures of Chinese Communist Party member or soldiers. So he was a state artist. But this is one of the paintings he did without a state commission. It's my island, my fishing village. Many years later, when I came to the West, 15 years later, I saw this famous painting by Swiss Italian painter, died 100 years ago, or 50 years ago. It's called The Eye of the Dead. And I thought, I know this island. When this little boat approaching this island in the middle of the sea, the death arriving. And I said, well, that's my village in my father's painting. So I found an immediate kind of, connection or nostalgia to certain kind of island or the image of death or this kind of isolation from the rest of the world. And I think it's the image of my childhood, how I grew up in this kind of backwater, kind of primitive island in China. And I wanted to talk about my origin, the linguistic identity. I come from ideogram, pictogram. I'm not come from your Latin European linguistic system, which based on the 26 letters. And I think I want to mention this because I found it very painful, totally bleak, hopeless when I switched from writing Chinese to writing English 12 years ago after I left China. Because my linguistic identity is ideogram, like Ezra Pound suggested, imagerism. So our writing, you can see fire, the first fire, and then become fire. And in calligraph, you can write fire like this. In the modern typing system on the computer, you write fire like this. And then tree, the traditional writing tree, and then in the calligraph tree, and then later on the tree, and the modern typing system tree, and then mountain. So you can write Chinese with picture, and then you need to learn how this picture being presented in the computer system. But in the calligraph, we still write totally pictogram system, a mountain. And I think I want to suggest that because I want you to somehow to understand the linguistic transition from a Chinese writer to a Anglophone or whatever European writer. My situation now is after published 8 Chinese books, I wrote last 9 books in English. Totally broken English. As you can tell, I pretend I speak good English, but when I write, I don't. So this is my linguistic identity, ideogram, nothing to do with European linguistic identity, yet I'm an Anglophone writer now. And that's my father, a communist state artist, was in prison forever and came out in the 70s. And I met him when I was 7 years old, when I finally able to meet my parents after the Cultural Revolution. And that's, one of his propaganda painting. It's called Soldiers and the Peasants Happy Together Play Basketball. And he painted, thousands of those communist propaganda paintings, posters. But yet none of those propaganda painters, you are allowed to write your authorship, you write your name. First, because propaganda poster is a collective work. So those kind of paintings, posters, is huge, like wall painting. I mean, in the West, you have Jesus Christ. In China, we have communists. So we paint huge thing on the wall. You are not allowed to write your name as an author, because normally a poster will be collaborated, between 10 or 12 people. And my father was one of those painters. And it's also a collective society, We don't have Leonardo da Vinci, we don't have Shakespeare, but we have many, many, many unnamed artists, not in the Western way, but in the Chinese kind of collective way under the autocracy, from the dynasty to the modern days. So that's our system, state artist. And yet I run away from that system. My mother, this is my mother, she doesn't look natural because she's on the stage in this photo. She was on the stage in 1970s, and she was one of those factory theater performance, little whatever nameless actress. She was performing all these revolutionary operas. So in China in the 70s, 80s, 1960s onwards, from 60 onwards, Chairman Mao's wife, Madame Mao, she said, we have to get rid of all the Western influence. We have to get rid of all the Western decadent art by inventing our own revolutionary opera to be completely spirit upright anti the West. So she invented what? Madame Mao invented 8 revolutionary operas, mainly about soldiers and women against the landlords, against the Western imperialism. So my mother was doing all these operas in the night. And in the day, she works in the factory. So I never saw her when I grew up. I never saw my parents. And, typical Chinese grow up under this system, communist system, because everybody worked so hard. Childhood doesn't exist. But in the 80s, China opened up. I was a teenager, and suddenly I discovered Beat Generation and poetry. I loved it. And I forever abandoned the classical Chinese book, rush into the American Beat Generation. And also those works are very well translated than Shakespeare, than Victorian literature. You can imagine China was not colonized, so it was very enclosed. The cultural reference is very difficult, direct to kind of feudal English literature. But we are very, I think, easy to connect to new American literature, literature from 80s, 90s. And I remember Allen Ginsberg was one of the first poets I understood, almost entirely. And another poet I understood was the 60s, 70s New York poet, Frank O'Hara, I'm sure you know. So one of the poems from Frank O'Hara called Orange. I'm writing a poem called Orange. Days pass, I didn't write Orange. I was writing a poem, I walk on the street, and I said, how can a Western poet write such direct street language, way Chinese speak? Confucius, classical English, Chinese, totally crazy nonsense. So I wanted to be a street writer rather than institutional writer. And I came to Beijing when I was 19 or 20 years old. I left my province. I went to film school. And I studied European cinema, European art. And in the 1990s, China, there's a crazy kind of underground movement. Everyone will become body artists, So you see all these photos, those crazy naked artists running on the Great Wall. So you saw this on the Great Wall, and I was there. I was 20 years old. All these were underground banned artwork, In China, until now, people like me has to stay out of the country because if you want to be in prison, okay, you go back. So these are the body artists in the 1990s I discovered in Beijing, and I was a young, naive country girl. So those are men, but they have long hair, very interesting, beautiful looking, naked and running on the wall. And this piece of work called something like "Fuck with Our Beautiful, Great 5,000 Years Old History," something like that. I love your SHIT in your title. I feel very comradeship with you. So, imagine, artists from those countries, just to say FUCK was like cool gesture, And I remember in the 90s, I was so influenced by those kind of primitive, rude body art. I wish I was one of them, and I wasn't brave enough taking off my clothes on the Great Wall. But these are strong influence for me, for a kid grow up in a communist house. Then I wanted to come to the West. And those experiences, I was in China writing books and making films. And one of the first book I wrote in Chinese, 20 Fragments of a Ravenel's Youth, and it's very fragmentary, not very narrative. And it's a novel recording a young country girl, wanted to discover the world, came to Beijing, want to be actress, want to be a filmmaker. Of course, it's very autobiographical. But on the other hand, it's about, kind of a little peasant against the state power. And then I made a film called The Concrete Revolution. It's a documentary film about China building the Olympics, using all the peasants to build this state ambition, yet individuals are lost, lonely, and dying. So these are one of those works I made. I published and made in China. Then I came to the West. I'm finishing soon. Then I came to the West. I have to use this very old 17th century European map because I didn't know West was so old. Because China created our own tragic cultural revolution, which destroyed thousands of years of the history. So in China, you don't see history. You heard history, you hear history, you read history. Visually, history doesn't exist visually, apart from Great Wall, Forbidden City. So history is in our head. But in Europe, history is in front of you, in the street, in the museum, which is shocking for me because I didn't have that experience in China. Old Europe, I came to Europe, and I came to London. then I had all this problem immigrant has, double problem, because I was from demonized country like China. If you're from demonized country from China or Russia or Cuba, all the things you heard is negative. From the BBC to the Guardian or CNN, everything about China is so negative. And I was so bored with this negativity. And yet, on the other hand, I was double prosecuted because visa wasn't right. I didn't have a state for a year. And that was the moment I decided I will switch my language. I will write in English, because in China I wrote 8 books in Chinese, and I published all my books, but all my books was either some paragraph missing, page missing. So I was banned after I left China. And after I left, I live in London, I realized I could no longer publish in Chinese. I could no longer really go back to China. So I decided I'm going to use my broken English to write. So I continued to write, want my dignity as an intellectual. I don't want to be just a mere immigrant. So the first novel I wrote in English is a concise Chinese-English dictionary for lovers. I was very much kind of inspired by this French philosopher Laurent Barthes' book, A Lover's Discourse. I loved it so much. So I thought I would record my conversation between me and my lover, at that time an Englishman. I record that on my diary in my broken English, primitive English. I will use that, and then I will use that diary to construct my novel. And a year later, I finished the novel, because it was very naturalistic, primitive way of doing a novel. A man and woman, they speak weird, odd English, exchange politically, socially, and about their intimacy and love, and the separation in the end. So that was the beginning of the end. I'm writing in English. I become an Anglophone writer after writing 8 books in Chinese. And then I'm China as my latest novel. I still couldn't justify why I write in English, even though, yes, I'm banned in China. But still, why should I abandon my glorious Chinese language, writing in English, second-hand English? So I couldn't justify that. In my last novel, I Am China, I use English translator as a central character. To be a novelist, I think I have to justify why I write in my broken second language. So I use this English translator as my central character. And in this novel, it's like the detective novel. She translating 2 lovers' diaries and correspondence. Through her translation from Chinese to English, and she discovered a love separation, a story about politics and separation. And I think using that linguistic device, I found myself be able to write in English again as kind of internal exile, internal reason of that language. So that's my last novel after, I think, 6 novels wrote in broken English. And then, of course, I made about nearly 10 films. And Sheer Chinese is my film, paid homage to La Chinoise by Jean-Luc Godard, because I studied cinema all my life, and I stayed in the film school all my life. But this one film, La Chinoise by Godard, from 1967, was a huge deal for Chinese, because he, as French revolutionary artist, have such a romantic idea about cultural revolution in China. Yet cultural revolution is an incredible tragic case, including my father's in prison forever. And I thought it's interesting comments from a French man to China, to communist revolution. So I would make a film about a reverse journey, a Chinese peasant communist girl leaving socialist country, came all the way to the capitalism, to the center of the capitalism, London, to discover what's the West like, what is individual about. So I made this film, Sheer Chinese. Now, if you see it, it's not very political film. It's pure, fragmented, kind of romantic film about the young girl's sexuality, really. But I think the original idea, it was 20 years ago when I saw that film. I wanted to make this film. But yet, I'm really a documentary filmmaker. I made some fiction film, but mainly I made other documentary films. So I think I taught everyone my life, and you should tell us too. And these are just a little entertainment for you, funny picture. The most famous Chinese book to the Westerners is this book by Ming Dynasty 400 years ago, Wu Cheng'en, called The Journey to the West. And I guess my journey to the West is another one, is a political one, is a one by immigrant. But this famous novel by Ming Dynasty Chinese writer is about a group of Buddhist monks' journey to India, try to capture the real Buddhism sutras so they can bring back to China to popularize it, to translate with a real spirit so they don't misinterpret the Buddhism in China. And I think this is a huge book, for Chinese and for the West to understand linguistic translation or the truth behind the text. And I think that's a book for me, it's hugely important for my journey and for my whatever called a transnational identity. I do feel the connection to that book. Sorry.
That was brilliant, really wonderful. I would definitely like to listen to more. And so listening to you speak, I thought to myself, thank God there's at least one other normal person in here. Because I've been to all these academic talks, and I think they're trying to beat the 20-minute clock. They sound like auctioneers or rappers, really rapid-fire deliveries. So I think at least you and me can speak normally. I really have no idea what I was thinking in terms of the title that I put in the program. They asked for a title. I gave them one that I thought would at least sound sufficiently pretentious enough to work in an academic setting. My talk is going to be less autobiographical. I don't have that much of an interesting history, I'm afraid. But I thought I would at least sort of introduce my work and the thinking that goes into sort of the three projects I'll be talking about. My first novel, Hairdresser of Harare, the second one, The Maestro, the Magistrate, and the Mathematician, and sort of a new work in progress that I've got going on, especially with regards to sort of your visual sensory aesthetics in the text. Because when you think about it, we take it for granted now, but there is a certain awkwardness in trying to depict sort of a three-dimensional space with words, something with texture and size and that kind of thing, using sort of your sensory cues like sight, smell, sound, which are pretty obvious. Perhaps we can even talk about touch, if you're thinking of elements like, hot, cold, that kind of thing, or taste, which is sort of by extension talking about a place through the culinary culture. So when I think about my first novel, I've gone through sort of a personal artistic evolution from the first book to the kind of stuff that I'm doing now. It's written in a first-person sort of linear type narrative, and you've got Wimbai, who's a single mum. She's a hairdresser, as the title suggests, low socioeconomic status, limited education. She flunked her O-levels, but she's essentially the character, the I who is telling you exactly what is going on. So I really want you guys to think about sort of the limitations then you have when you have a central character. It sort of determines what you can or you can't do in terms of the elements that you use within that narrative. So the Zimbabwean reader knows the city of Harare, which is the presumed reader of the novel. Wimbai doesn't overly concern herself with architecture or the cityscape. Just a quick note to say I'll be using cityscape, landscape, sort of very loosely and interchangeably. She's more interested in sort of the intricate social and political relations going on in the story. An example would be, say, chapter 18, which says, I passed by the Reserve Bank to look at my face in the windows. Seeing my face, I felt ugly. I was a puny, ugly interest standing at the base of one of the tallest buildings in the city, which the likes of me could never hope to ascend. So in that text, you pretty much see there's a tall building. You don't get a sense of how tall it is, what its actual dimensions are. You know you're in a city, but apart from that, there really isn't anything. And unless you're Zimbabwean and you know the space, everyone knows what the Reserve Bank looks like. There is that presumption. But I'm also thinking that the book isn't completely without descriptions, but where you do find them within the text, they tend to be very spare and very sparse. Now, one of the earliest and certainly the most formidable critics of the Shona novel, specifically the Shona language novel, but I think this will also relate to sort of English language novels by certain Shona writers. His name is G.P. Kahari, and he had something very strong to say about sort of like this lack of a certain visual aesthetic within Shona novels. He said, settings are not clearly elaborated or well delineated, except by a few authors. In this case, the Zimbabwean novel in Shona lags behind its counterpart in English and hardly measures up to its other counterpart, the West African novel. The Shona novel is more and more a dramatic statement rather than a demonstration of its settings as representing certain ideas and human values. There is no extended effort to describe scenery. And then he goes on to outline what he thinks are sort of like the three reasons why this is the case. The first reason is nature does not appear to be apprehended in an independent reality in its colorful and decorative aspect, but as an inseparable, indivisible, and integral part of the entire traditional world. I think there he was mainly sort of like relating to text with a pre-colonial or rural setting. The second reason he outlines is that traditional narration, which has so influenced the modern novelist, gave no scenery unless it had a significant role to play in the plot. So you're thinking of sort of like your oral storytelling. Man walks into a bar. Once upon a time, there was this and that. There was a castle. So there's no really great attempt in the Shona oral story tradition to describe places visually. The third reason, probably which that first novel narrated by Wimbai would fall into, is that authors take it for granted that readers are aware of the significance of the settings. But thinking about Kahari, I also thought about a sort of like Marxist theory that I came across by a guy called Leonard J. Davis, who wrote a text called Resisting Novels, something about ideology in fiction, etc. And he was really trying to grapple with how or why we even have sort of these visual landscapes or cityscapes within text. And he traced it to Robinson Crusoe, Defoe's book. And for Davis, the idea was the novel moves hand in hand with sort of like the imperial capitalist project. So for example, a forest in England isn't exactly the same as a forest in America. So novelists, by extension, were aiding the colonial project by producing sort of like signs and signifiers as sort of like linguistic justification for the colonial project. So, I mean, in Robinson Crusoe, you have an island, and through language, he begins to claim it, to name things, up to and including, is it Friday, the other inhabitant within the text? And I thought that colonial aspect was pretty interesting, particularly when I think about the transition to my next novel, which is The Maestro, the Magistrate, and the Mathematician. So you can see that leaving Harare for Edinburgh automatically sort of demands that I engage with landscape descriptions. So I'm almost letting you guys in on a secret that there was a secret Zimbabwean imperial project to invade the UK, starting from Scotland and then working our way down. Obviously, post-Brexit, we've decided we don't want it anymore. Yeah, they're fucking up enough without us. Maybe we'll try Spain instead. But again, one of the problems that I faced, maybe problem is the wrong word, considerations, is that the presumed Zimbabwean reader of the text doesn't know the city. And I want to contrast this with sort of like the heritage industry type portrayal of the United Kingdom, Shakespeare's country, the little villages, Victorian type cities, and that kind of thing, which is, there is a really well packaged description of the UK that you see in certain films and when you read certain novels, etc. And it's very hard to contrast this with sort of like your realistic depictions of poor estates, say, in Wester Hells and Craig Miller. And this, I think Edinburgh for me is sort of like a foreign, grey, and exotic place, all right? And again, I'll return to the role of the characters. The book is written in a third-person limited type narrative, but with each narrative, you kind of follow the key character. So I'm thinking of the metaphor of the forest here for the city, a place of opportunity, a place of exploration and discovery. Certainly, the magistrate, through music and memory, engages in a sort of active, conscious, psychogeographical experiment to try to use Zimbabwean music to superimpose his own memories into the city. And towards the end of the novel, he creates a map following all these bus routes that he takes to work, and sort of like the central interesting places aren't your touristy type places, but more of the nursing homes. These are the areas that he and other Zimbabweans work. The mathematician, who is younger, wealthier, is into partying, so the Edinburgh that you get there is more of a depiction of the nightlife, bright, vibrant, with opportunities for sex and all the exciting things in life. And the maestro is sort of at the other end of the spectrum. He's sort of alienated, but again, he's still exploring the city, going to sites like graveyards and other sort of unsalubrious areas of the city. I don't have the time to sort of like read different passages through the three works, but I hope I'm giving you an impression of what I was working with there. You can sort of imagine the characters in pith helmets going forth and exploring. I thought for me, and I had a lot of different ideas when I was writing the book. One of the things that I wanted to capture but failed was the moment when the unfamiliar becomes familiar. And this I'm sort of thinking of, an example would be, the moment when you're in a place and the taxi driver is a bit lost and you end up giving him the directions because somehow you know what's going on. But there were a lot of other considerations that I was working through the narrative, so that got jettisoned, and I think this is a natural process of writing. At the moment, I'm working on a new novel, the next one. At the moment, it's entitled All the Beautiful Things That Sorrow Brings. Don't normally talk about work in progress. I might have to kill you all just to protect this secret. But again, I've moved on a little bit. I'm sort of thinking now about psychology and the cityscape. But I'm no longer thinking about sort of like places as an objective reality, but something aligned to psychological processes and perception. I wrote something pretty funky earlier. Now I tried to decipher it, and I have no idea what I was trying to say. But it sounds great. It says, the urban is our creation. We are gods there. It is also our prison, and we are trapped. We can make it anything we want, and it also makes us. Being an author, I don't even need to explain that. You figure it out yourselves. But in this current novel, I'm working with a character who is alienated, perhaps depressed, anxiety-ridden, an unperson. And when I use unperson, it's not in the strict sort of like Orwellian totalitarian sense of sort of like a state type of censorship or rejection, but in the slightly more social definition of a person who is accorded no recognition or consideration by another or by a specific group. So with this unperson, for example, they're unnamed, ungendered, unracialized. It's you pretty much have a consciousness there. There's even a chapter that I've attempted without the pronoun I, because how can you be an I if you are not? And I've tried using sort of a slightly stream of consciousness type narrative in an attempt to move to sort of like a purer, less curated, or shall we say mediated representation of cityscapes and mental processes. And this is characterized by, I don't think there's anything particularly new or original about this. I'm sure all these techniques have been used before. So it's characterized by temporal or spatial leaps, dream sequences, incoherence, unreliable or contested representations, an overload of sensations that are normally sort of like filtered for you. You've got no street names, no places that are actually named that you can pin down in this narrative. So I'll give you guys a quick taste, like a short reading for a chapter that I did where the character is in a city space, standing there checking shit out, and you've kind of got to remember that there is no I here. Like long summers that end, slow lifts down mine shafts, sunlight screams in pillars through the red-nosed sky. Stand on the cracked pavement. Moss under feet and decaying sewage cables and electric pipes. Inhale the sulfate-infused fresh morning air, and shadows so long they have no end, into their cold embrace weep. Only the rush of the 2-minute late clock atop the high towers tells false tales of sailors lost at sea amidst the bustling commuters. Formalin in veins pumping to the one ventricle and then the other purple fingers. The horizon glints gold in the east end. The rumbling, guttural throat that whooshes hereby, hear it. And in the dizzy confines of a now crushed under the ashen avalanche past come to pass, stand on the cracked pavement. Observe the green man walk and the red man stand. In or off the bitter bite of morning sacred breath, through which the breeze of the first word sprang forth light unto darkness, on one of the seven followed all, perturbing the empty none from which some saw sprung. Cancer creeps on black suit through the ancient city stones, heavy, scarred, bruised, and battered by history. For it clings in acid rain smoldering that which must come down when burnt offerings to new gods are mailed. Look at them, the walls, phantoms painted on or upon, eroding with a parasitic entropy from which nothing is safe. And yonder, the loch-turned park garden windows block in shadows peep. So like last week I was at a Kane Prize workshop with fellow writers from the continent in Tanzania, and we were sort of like preparing pieces for an anthology that will be published later on this year. So I thought I would try this, and I got a lot of interesting feedback about the piece, which ranged from sort of like bemused bafflement. I was told it was in a way incomprehensible. Where is the story? What does it mean? And you kind of look like a moron as you're trying to say, oh, but I'm trying to do this and that and this and that, and it's like, well, but yeah, where's the story? So it's a work in progress. It might very well be that I'm going through some kind of like self-indulgent phase, because the workshop did emphasize sort of like the relationship between the reader and the writer. The idea that there's sort of like certain anthropological limitations as to what you can or cannot do. I mean, I'm going to plow ahead sort of like regardless and sort of see what happens then. In my head, it sounds like a decent idea, but when it comes to writing, there's a whole chain of other people that the text goes through, the agent, the editor, etc., before it even gets to the reader. So it'll be interesting. Maybe you're the only other people in the world who get to experience this text.
So, I should just connect back my early introduction for myself to the conference, the theme, because I truly felt when Isabel invited me, and I truly felt all my life and all my work is from this, describing the transition from a rural, traditional agriculture society to an urbanized society, which is my life and the Chinese life, in the last 20 years, what's going on in the third world China becomes the first world China, in the radical 20 years of transition of my life and my country's life, and it's no longer my country because legally I'm no longer Chinese. I'm a European. I'm proud to be a culturally European. Although blood, no one can find out what's your original blood. But anyway, so when I wrote my first novel in Chinese, 20 Fragments of Ravenel's Youth, is this kind of painful record of a young girl's physical pain of growing into a woman and the emotional angst to conquer the city, a hard communist city like Beijing, how she transits from her little peasant memory to a citizenship. And then this idea of insufficient citizen, which I felt so strongly last 15 years living in London and Berlin, which now I made both the city as my home. Most of the time in London, and then rest of the time I go to Berlin because I could no longer really function in the first country where I came from. But when I say insufficient citizen, is really the crude urbanization, modernization, which divorces an author and a human being from her or his original belonging. I came from peasant village, and my parents supposed to be fishermen, peasant, and China was still agricultural society until 20 years ago. And this radical transition, I think, made us came to the West, searching for the first-hand, westernized, the Western first identity, which I was one of them. A huge part I played this kind of globalized, this global immigrant. So then I became an immigrant writer, exiled writer. I fit into all this catalog, yet I fit into nowhere in a way, where is my original, identity? And I have to recreate my own identity in the West in the last 15 years. But I say that because I think the urbanization creates such a huge alienation, upon the individual and upon the community, for example. And I wrote a novel called UFO in Her Eyes, and it's about a little Chinese village in south of China, underneath the totalitarianism, and how the peasants claimed they saw a UFO one day, and the policeman came from the Beijing capital, came down to the city to investigate every village. Did you see a UFO? Did you see an alien, as you claimed? And I wrote a novel when I lived in Paris, was studying French, tried to make a film, and then eventually I published that novel in English. Then I translated the novel back into Chinese because I wanted to make it into film. And I think that was a film I would never make if I still lived in China, because this huge angst, how we lost our land, the physical farmland, and then the habitual peasant identity, change our ID card, because in Chinese society we have only two kind of people: peasants household, citizen household. And I struggled, like my family, change our ID card from peasant household to citizen household. Therefore, we will be legal to immigrant to city or migrant to city, get a city job, legal to have a city household with registration system. Our children in the future would have legal citizenship rather than peasant household citizenship. So this kind of transition, which created this kind of angst, identity angst, because in China, if you know, we're not allowed to move around without 3 ID card, citizen ID card, and then the city living work permit ID card, and then the third one is some sort of a bullshit ID card. And just you have to acquire all this citizenship to be living in the modern city. And then when I came to the West, when I came to Europe, when I wrote all these novels in my broken English, And that's also the process to legalize myself linguistically and culturally. When I lost my Chinese citizenship, became British, and that process, it took me 10 years to legalize myself culturally and politically. And I think when I got this invitation from Isabel, and I thought this is hugely relevant, for a writer, for an artist from faraway place, apart from migration, apart from urbanization, which created in such huge angst, I think, in the person and in the person's work. Yeah.
Yeah, we really could go on and on, but I see Carla's come up here to stop us in a way. But just it felt to me as you were saying that we're really talking sort of like culture and history also determine sort of like the aesthetics or the depictions of what goes into a work. But
yeah, I mean, in a way, I think the immigrant artist is like body artist. When I was young, I was hopelessly romantic. So I said, if I would be artist or a writer, I would be body writer or body artist. In a sense of also this femininity, I think the female body carries this tragic historical narrative as a second sex. I mean, I was a hopeless feminist when I was in China, and then I came to Europe. I became another sort of feminist because it's very different to bring up under the communist regime. Only Mao came into our society, kind of destroyed this feudal system, although Mao is demonized in the West as Stalin. But in China, Mao is complex. It's not Stalin at all, and it's not hero at all. It's much more complex. But so I grew up in that kind of actually much more feminist environment, post-Mao environment. And I think this kind of physical awareness as a woman, recording our history, and as an immigrant, because you carry this new life. When you're born a child, the child is no longer from that country. This child is a product of your second country. And she spoke the language actually you hate. Even though with your identity, you have to adopt a language to shape your new dignity as an artist. But I don't belong to that language. I think I have this kind of crazy hostile relationship to the language I'm speaking now. And nothing to do with my ideogram identity, but I use both, in order to survive. So the practicality take over. And I think as an immigrant, again, I use this word, insufficient citizen. That's the situation you are,
Okay, so we really don't have much time left, but maybe we can have 10 minutes for questions or comments that you'd like to make. I have a question for both of you, although I'm going to frame it from within the African context. Tendai, you talked about the Caine Prize workshop that you were at, and I'm reminded of an article written by Ranko Primoratz about the creative writing programs that writers who are diasporic Africans are often enlisted into and are affiliated with in one way or another. And I'm wondering about your experiences, both of you, about expectations from the West, framing yourselves in a particular way. Something that Primoratz mentions in that article is a book by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, The Thing Around Your Neck. And there's a particular story there which is based on the Caine Prize, in which the persona is writing a story and is told by the Caine Prize organizer, this isn't the authentic Africa. So to what extent do you feel constrained to represent a country or a continent as somebody within a different context now?
I think that's a very interesting question. So sort of like for me as an artist, I don't feel any particular constraints. I just do whatever the fuck I like. What you then get is sort of like you almost have to brace yourself for the slightly awkwardness that the way your work is received might be very, very different from what you originally intend. And this is kind of problematic. I know there's a lot of people in the post-colonial department here. It's not to diss you guys, but probably, my work won't get read in a literature department. No one's particularly interested in the language I'm using or anything like that. The people who are bound to read it are the people in post-colonial studies who come at it at a certain angle. And so certain things get like really highlighted. I mean, there'll be buzzwords through your texts: homosexuality, HIV, AIDS, poverty, politics, etc. Those are the kind of things that people hone in on. And sort of like one of the weird things for me is at the end of the day, you don't really feel like an artist because it's kind of like everything else that you put in the text doesn't really matter unless you've got those elements. Yeah.
I think it's hugely relevant, especially someone like me from the country prosecute you because you were supposed to be, betrayer, I mean, like Nabokov was so prosecuted in a way, in the media, in the Russian society after he published 8 Russian novels, but no one knows him in the US. And he published first novel in English, Lolita, was national sensation or international sensation, and he was very bitter about that. And I think I can't relate my own case to those masters, but on the other hand, it's so complicated, this relationship to the first country I came from, because yet I now live in the third country, in Berlin, and the second country, in London. But I don't mention the city because for me, city is a country. I was prosecuted deeply, in the final years when I stayed in China because my books, my films, not upright enough, and that's the reason I left. When I left, and when I published, quite globally, like first novel in English, the dictionary novel was 28 language. Although this novel never should be translated into other language because it's about broken English and the broken identity in England. But it was translated everywhere in the world, and then of course I got a very bad review in Chinese society. Can she present us? Can she present the Chinese society? And on the other hand, I said, can I write in English in the country awash by BBC and the perfect English Queen, Queen speech everywhere as the English, Can I do that in England rather than I should go to America? Perhaps I'll be accepted in America easily, And I think I would struggle with this kind of double prosecution from both cultures, the large linguistic culture, And then, for example, the Nobel Prize winner Gao Xingzhen before Mo Yan, who wrote in French, lived in Paris for the last 30 years after he went to exile. He's a French writer. So when he won the Nobel Prize, is he a French writer or is he a Chinese writer? Is a linguistic identity define him? Or the content will define him? And it was a huge deal between China, France, and the Swedish Academy. And then they had to apologize, later on, some years later, give Mo Yan, the state writer, the Chinese writer, Nobel Prize 2 years ago, and which caused a huge controversial in the West. Say, why the Swedish Academy give to such a state writer Nobel Prize? What a shame, And those things are very interesting because inviting you as a Westerner to understand what's going on, the political, moral judgment to the writers, artists from those nations, rather than really look at the context of the book, And I think I suffer those kind of identity which been imposed on me, who I am. And some years ago, I think 3 years ago, I received this, funny honor as one of the Granta's best young British novelists. And I thought, oh God, I never thought I'm a British novelist. I'm one of the best British novelists. And the first reaction, I'm not lying, the first reaction, I was so ashamed by that word British because I guess if you come from the country like China or those countries, it was so classified. The ideological shadow with the vocabulary. What does it mean being British? It's so negative. As what does it mean being communist Chinese? It's so negative in the U.S. that I couldn't bear this name. Then I was called to be on the stage. You've been told you're British now, and I don't feel any way British. I actually feel culturally European, totally. But the thing is, those identities were given to you But of course, they don't define my book. I continue to write books about different culture, all that. So you struggle to get out from those kind of jacket people give to you. But it's huge thing, for a writer like us to struggle to get my own name rather than a name underneath a big national hat. Huge deal, yeah.
I have a really specific question concerning your book and film UFO in Her Eyes, which I've seen the film, I haven't read the book, and I really enjoyed it. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about your choice. I mean, this American shows up in this Chinese province. I think I understand why you made him an American, but then also for the film, a German actor was cast, Udo Kier, and that struck me when I watched the film, and I just wanted to know your sort of ideas behind that choice.
Yeah, I don't want to bore you because tomorrow we show another film, so maybe if you didn't see that film, so it'll be confusing. So I'm just going to do some very generic introduction of that film. UFO in the Eyes is about a little village. Some woman said that she saw a UFO, and then the policeman came, and she said, I saw on that day, 911 that day, and also after the UFO, I saw a foreigner, an alien. She didn't know if it's American. And this absurd novel. The novel is very schematic. It's very, intellectual. In English, meaning bad. I love the novel because I didn't want to write a story. And when you say where's the story, I'm a totally anti-story writer. I think it's confidence. It's a confidence we say we can convey stuff behind and beyond story. Story is a tool. So what I try to do is to talk about China as ideological junkyard, because in that novel and later on the film is much better than novel. I'm the only artist say my film is much better than my original book. So just watch the film if you are lazy enough. So because all the writers say, well, my books are better. No. Some film can be better too. So I claim that. Anyway, because I make my own film from my own books, so it doesn't matter which one. What I try to do is to claim the leader, the chief of that village is superb ideological junkyard warehouse inventor, because what's going on in China is from this feudal society, thousand years, and 80 years ago, China became, the emperor lost under the Soviet power, and then the civil war with Japanese. Suddenly, China adopted Marxism out of nowhere. Yeah, it's not a native-born ideology. Native-born ideology is Zen Buddhism. That's the only thing we had in China. And then we adopted Marxism, we adopted Leninism, and it was huge ideological umbrella which made Americans hate us so much. But it's your pure Western Jewish invention. We love it. And then the Cultural Revolution, we went to this huge state socialism, state communism, which is so radical, go beyond all the scale, and then the tragic case of Cultural Revolution, and then people died, intellectuals died, and then zoom into this super state capitalism, which adopt again, start from Deng Xiaoping, who is the first president in 1978, went to Atlanta City in the US, met Jimmy Carter, said, how come your Coca-Cola company is so successful? Can I learn something from a communist leader? Brave man, and he, of course, he's demonized again in China because he is the first man to open the door to the West, learn to be American, So China learned what's Coca-Cola about, what's the American system about, then open up the whole East Coast, Hong Kong, Macau, whatever you call those 4 little towns. They become the pseudo, kind of huge capitalism, success. And then the whole China opened up from 80s, 90s. And so the film and the book want to suggest, how successful this ideology warehouse could be. You don't need to be ideological to become an ideological warehouse collector. You just need to adopt tomorrow what's useful. Okay, borrow that. Anarchism useful, borrow that, use that. So it's in a way, it's very cynical, so cynical that people start to be very scared, I think, in the end of the book, because it's a comedy. And you laugh out. It's a crazy thing the leaders did in that village. And for me, that's my study after I left China, living in Germany and in England. My study, how the Western use ideology. For example, in Germany, so complete dedicated to certain kind of thinking. and then vice versa, if the new generation come, to the opposite. And in the UK, it's very kind of careful, diplomatic, nearly, the neoliberalism, be careful, they all use it, or, but in Chinese sense, we use it pragmatically in the extreme extent. So I just want to comment on that, from my Western experience and the study of the Chinese ideology, which is not ideological at all underneath. It's just pragmatic way of doing the country, managing the country. But anyway, so maybe we should show that film tomorrow instead, Isabel. I think because we couldn't decide which film we should show tomorrow in the lunch hour, because sheer Chinese 100 minutes, which is going to make you too hungry in the lunch hour. And then another film about Britain, about city in Britain, about street people in Britain. That's 70 minutes about, really to do with Brexit. So depends which film you want to see. Yeah.
I don't think we have any more time left. Perhaps we can finish this session by thanking again the authors for their fascinating comments.
Let's see what we survived.